Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our rapid readout today, the latest on budget reconciliation. I'm Dan Brissett. I'm the president of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. And today we are biting off a big part of a small discussion about a very, very big topic. And that is a very good thing because we have a tremendous guest who's joining us in just a minute, and she will help us catch up with events. A few weeks ago, we unveiled a brand new briefing format, which we call rapid readouts. This is one of them. The idea is that if you give us 30 minutes, we will give you what you need to know about a climate, clean energy, or an environmental topic that's in the news. Of course, all of our regular briefings and other educational resources will continue. And in fact, next Friday, we will have an online briefing about federal highway policy. And then the following week, we will have a briefing that will feature Ice Cream Sundays about extreme heat. And that will be featuring our friends at the Federation of American Scientists, and we'll be discussing their new heat action plan. To RSVP and to watch those events, please visit us online and subscribe to Climate Change Solutions, which is our biweekly newsletter, and that will help you keep up with everything we've got going on. So as we get started in our rapid readout today, we want to hear from you and take your questions about budget reconciliation and the package of proposals that's moving through Congress. And so we are using Mentimeter today to help you do that. To share your thoughts, please join our poll. If you scan the QR code on the first slide, then you're already there. If you didn't, you can go to menti.com, that's menti.com, and type in the code at the top of the screen. Once you're there, you'll be able to give your input by selecting everything that you're curious about and then ranking each of those items. It's all anonymous, totally anonymous, but you'll see what everyone shares here on the screen. And I can see some things coming in already, so thank you very much for that. Back in February, we held a briefing during Congressional Climate Camp about the intersection of budget reconciliation and appropriations. If you missed that briefing, I encourage you to go back and revisit it because it goes into a lot of great depth on the topics that we'll be discussing in a few minutes. Budget reconciliation has become a preferred approach to legislating priorities, and that has become even more so in the times of tight majorities. And that's made the process hyper-partisan. And when it comes with limitations, though, and that is something that Congress is currently experiencing, the process also amplifies certain differences in how the Senate and House work. And it's a lot of information, especially for people who are new to the Capitol Hill. The reason why this is topic of our rapid readouts today is that the outcome of the budget reconciliation discussions happening on the Hill will almost certainly involve major changes to climate, clean energy, and environmental policies that were enacted in 2022 as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. And because time is a flat circle, the IRA was also a product of budget reconciliation, although the majorities and the minorities have since flipped. To help us make sense of everything that's going on in the news and on Capitol Hill these days, our first speaker is Molly Reynolds. And actually, she's our only speaker today. We have her for the entire time. Molly is a senior fellow in governance studies at Brookings. We were lucky to have Molly join us back in February during Congressional Climate Camp, and we're very lucky to have her back today to help us understand all that has happened since February 13th, what we can expect to happen next, and how that could impact clean energy tax incentives and other policies and investments provided by Congress and the IRA. So that is no short order, but if there is any person who can do it, it is Molly. Molly, thank you so much for joining our rapid readout today. I'm really looking forward to your presentation.
Well, excuse me. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here. I'm going to do, with my initial opening remarks, I'm going to do two things, I hope. The first is to give you all a sense of what are the steps in the budget reconciliation process, and then importantly, where are we right now in that process? And then I'll talk a little bit about some policy items that are probably of particular interest to this audience, kind of what do we already know about what the Senate's plans are, what should we be watching, that sort of thing. So to start with, in terms of where are we in the reconciliation process, do you want to go to the next slide? Or the next click? Yeah. So these are the sort of steps of the process that we've already been through. So to use budget reconciliation to make policy change, first the House and the Senate have to adopt in identical form a budget resolution that contains what we call reconciliation instructions Those are directives to individual congressional committees to report out changes in the programs within their jurisdictions that achieve a certain amount of budgetary change. That happened earlier this year. This year, the next thing that we saw happen was that the House committees developed their language, developed their reconciliation submissions, kind of what each of the House committees that had been named in the instructions, what they wanted to see in the bill. And so this included things like the Ways and Means Committee, which has jurisdiction over the tax code. So that's where all of the tax provisions are. And then it included lots of other committees in the House as well. We saw those committees work on their submissions, hold markups. The next thing that happened is they got all those submissions got sent to the House Budget Committee. The House Budget Committee has what's usually we think of as a pro forma role in this process, which is basically to package everyone's submissions together and send them on to the floor. This ended up being actually a little bit of a stumbling block in the House. You may recall that the House Budget Committee convened, I think it was on a Friday, in order to put together the rest of the submissions and send them on to the floor. And then turns out didn't quite have the votes from the members of the Budget Committee to do that. So we were in for sort of an extra weekend of negotiating. And then we saw the House's bill considered on the House floor and where it passed very narrowly, but it did pass just before the Memorial Day recess. All right, next click. And then these are the steps that happen in the Senate. So one of the things that is really, excuse me, important in the Senate with reconciliation is the fact that because reconciliation bills are protected from a filibuster in the Senate, they're sort of very closely protected from things that shouldn't actually be part of the process, as a way of trying to guard against kind of too much intrusion into the overall legislative process where the filibuster is still in place. And so this is where the Senate's parliamentarian comes into play. She sort of reviews reconciliation text for two purposes in the Senate. One is to determine whether there's anything in the bill that means that it's not actually a reconciliation bill, that it really shouldn't be protected from a filibuster, that it shouldn't be eligible for these special expedited procedures. We talk about that as a privilege review. The bill is privileged on the floor of the Senate, and so she reviews it for that content. If she identifies something in the bill that is a privilege problem, that threatens the privilege of the bill, that is potentially fatal to the overall bill. That's potentially her saying, no, this can't be considered under these expedited procedures in the Senate. It's actually subject to a filibuster, sort of taken on something that makes it no longer fit the definition of a reconciliation bill. So that privilege scrub needs to happen before the Senate can start considering the legislation if it's going to bring up the House's version as the basis for amendment in the Senate. The second thing that she does is review the material that the Senate is intending to put in the bill for whether it is compliant with something that we call the Byrd Rule. The Byrd Rule, named for former Senate Majority and Minority Leader Robert Byrd. And the Byrd Rule basically attempts to cabin what is permissible in the reconciliation process. Senator Byrd in the mid-'80s was quite concerned that more and more things were going to get packed into this filibuster-proof legislative vehicle. So he drafted a rule. There are 6 parts of it. But the basic idea is to kind of keep budget reconciliation legislation budgetary and to require things that aren't budgetary in nature to stay out of the bill. So the parliamentarian she hears from both sides of the aisle, from committee staff on the Republican side of the aisle and the Democratic side of the aisle, on arguments as to whether things do or do not comply with the Byrd Rule. And then she issues guidance to the Senate on based on past precedent, the text of the rule, that sort of thing, what does and does not fit into the reconciliation bill on those grounds. Once the Senate's committees have developed their draft language, then the legislation goes to the floor in the Senate. Should it pass the Senate, then we will be in the stage of resolving bicameral differences. Next click. So this is the part of the process where we are right now. And you'll note that here, instead of it just being sort of a straight arrow through the process, I have sort of circular arrows, and that's because this is iterative. So as Senate committees are developing their language for the Senate's reconciliation bill, that also has to be cleared with the parliamentarians. So the parliamentarian is reviewing kind of what the House has already done, but also as Senate committees have new ideas or things that weren't in the House bill, those also need to go through the parliamentarian's office. And then she may say yes, she may say, or she may advise yes, she may advise no, and then Senate committees may need to respond to that. One other process note before I go on to the substance. One question that's still a little bit open right now is exactly how will Senate committees do their work on this bill. So in the House, we did see the House's committees hold markups, sort of formal meetings where the Republicans and the Democrats were in the room, and there were amendments offered to the text in the purview of individual committees. The Senate does not seem headed for a place where all of the Senate's committees will definitely do markups. Indeed, we've seen a couple of Senate committees already release their text. This suggests that the Republicans on these committees have been working on this, but have chosen not to hold a formal markup. The last language that I saw from Leader Thune on this question is that Senate markups will be highly optional, so we may still see some next week. The goal, as stated by the Senate Republican leadership, is to have all committees release their draft text by the end of next week, so basically a week from now. So we may see some markups, or we may just see committees have worked on this text behind the scenes and then release it and have it packaged together as a full text substitute amendment on the floor. All right, next slide. So in terms of what we should be watching substantively, that's probably of interest to this audience, I'll sort of divide this into two categories. The first are things that we know the Senate is interested in addressing in its bill because some committees, for the purposes of this conversation, of most interest is the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, have already released their draft text. And so some things that are in EPW's draft text, but again, this may or may not all stay as it is by the time the measure gets to the floor, both for reasons involving the Byrd Rule, but also we have to remember that the Senate is ultimately trying to build a 51-vote coalition in favor of this legislation. So there are things in individual committee submissions that might ultimately have to come out for political reasons and not necessarily reasons that have to do with the Byrd Rule. But things that are in the EPW text include a pause on the enforcement of the methane tax, rescission, so cuts, in most cases, elimination of various programs under the Inflation Reduction Act, including the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, a repeal of the tailpipe emissions rule for light and medium duty vehicles. And then it retains from the House version, I don't recall if it's exactly the same, but in concept, a similar opt-in fee for review of certain, to expedite the review of certain infrastructure projects under the National Environmental Policy Act. So those are some things that we already know the Senate intends to do. In terms of what we are still watching here, there are a lot of questions about the slate of clean energy tax credits. So just politically, I'll say that on one hand, we do have at least 4 Republican senators, Senators Curtis, Murkowski, Tillis, and Moran, who came out earlier this year wanting to preserve the tax credits in full. We also have senators, including Mike Lee, who's an important committee chairman in this context, saying that they want to repeal the tax credits in full. The House already came down on much closer to sort of full repeal. The House bill terminates all the credits that go directly to consumers and households after 2025. It left in place some of the credits, but at least temporarily, but phases them out, and indeed sped up the phase out as one of the things that was happening in the late stage negotiations of trying to get to a House majority. So here are things. The basic thing is that clean energy projects that have to clean energy projects have to begin within 60 days of enactment and start operating before 2029 to be eligible for the production and investment tax credits. Nuclear projects are handled a little bit differently. So also noting here that that's another place where we could see the Senate choose three different things in terms of how it treats different forms of energy differently. The other couple other things that we have yet to see how they'll resolve, but are also worth watching, are what happens with the possibility of national registration fees for electric vehicles or hybrids. In the House, this provision was in the purview of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. The Environment and Public Works Committee did not include this provision in their submission, but because of split jurisdiction issues in the Senate, it could still come up elsewhere. There are provisions around what are called foreign entities of concern that basically stand to affect the supply chain for batteries and critical minerals that we could see changes to. And there are also questions around whether the bill would call for more public land sales, which is something that the House talked about, ultimately did not put in their bill, but Senator Lee is very supportive of. So we could sort of see that come back. I will stop there so that we have some time for questions, but that hopefully gives you a good sense of kind of what the process is, where we are, and some things to be paying attention to.
Wow. So Molly, that was a lot. Thank you very much. I know you're spending a lot of time thinking about this, and it's changing very rapidly, and I really appreciate how succinctly you were able to talk about it and how organized your way of thinking is. We asked people to offer ideas for what we wanted to talk about in the Q&A and submit questions. Let me also say that you can still ask questions using the Mentimeter. You can also send us an email if you'd prefer, or if you're not using the Mentimeter today, you can send us an email, and the email address to use is ask, that's ASK, at eesi.org. But the number one thing that people indicated that they wanted to continue talking or learn a little bit more about is the policy outcomes. So as I mentioned in the introduction, a lot of what was included in terms of climate in the Inflation Reduction Act is very much at stake in what's happening on the Hill right now. And like you were explaining, the clean energy tax incentives feels like ground zero for a lot of these discussions. There was is it a scalpel? Is it a sledgehammer? All of that. But to the extent that those, whether it's manufacturing, EVs, energy efficiency, solar, wind, that seems to be where there's a lot of energy. Because this is ultimately, you boil this down to revenues, and this is a 10-year bill, there's 10 years of overlap, money's being moved from one line to the other. How much of this is a zero-sum game? Is it possible, and what are the options available to Congress to maybe keep some of the tax incentives from the IRA in place, but also pursue some of their other priorities that are also tax priorities, like preserving the tax cuts from the first Trump administration?
Yeah, so I think you've hit on a really important point here, which is that I wouldn't say it's like strictly a zero-sum game, because there are lots of other pieces that you can also try and move around the chessboard. But one of the reasons that the clean energy tax credits, I think, have come under, again, whether it's a scalpel or a sledgehammer, whether they are sort of firmly in the line of fire, that's a different metaphor, but you know what I mean, is that they both help open up fiscal space for other things that the Republican majority really wants to do in this bill, which is do additional tax cuts and also extend and or make permanent the tax cuts that were enacted as part of, or some of the tax cuts that were enacted as part of the 2017 tax law, which begin to expire at the end of this calendar year. So there's a policy reason for doing it. And then there's also a political reason for doing it. So we know that when the IRA was passed, it was also done through the reconciliation process. So a lot of these credits are seen as sort of Democratic priorities that Republicans are not interested in protecting. I do think this question of, are any of the senators who have come out and said that these are important to preserve, in many cases because they have spurred significant investments in their states, does that alter the calculus at all? I don't know. We talked about that a lot in the House context, and in the end, it didn't really seem to matter in the House. Even at the end of the day, when the House was trying to get to yes, this was not the thing that some of those House Republicans had stepped up for. In some cases, because those House Republicans were the same House Republicans who were also trying to fight to preserve a change to the state and local tax, how state and local taxes are treated. And we can, if folks are interested, there's a whole other set of policy issues that aren't in the environment space that could be sticking points that I didn't even talk about. But I do think that in the clean energy tax credit space, they sort of sit at the intersection of Republicans' policy incentives and Republicans' political incentives.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a really important point. And it's not that necessarily the evaluation is not, is the tax incentive good or bad? It's how can the tax incentive coexist along these other priorities? And ultimately, the majorities that will pass these bills have to make that call about where their lines are. Another question, people are really interested kind of in the outcomes, and we know what the House has passed. You described this in your first slide, that there's this iterative process between, sort of, step forward, step back in terms of what's acceptable and what can pass the House. Do you have any thoughts about how much sort of the Venn diagram of what can pass the Senate and what can pass the House with sort of the barest of majorities? How much of that is part of the strategy with what's happening right now in the Senate, with whether it's the EPW bill or the EPW proposals that have come out? How much of that is on their mind, and how much of that is strategy, and how much of that is, are we just in the this is everything that we want phase of the discussion?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that they're probably thinking about strategy now. They'll be thinking about strategy even more as we move through the process. Because at the end of the day, the rules are really important here, and they do constrain the kinds of deals that Republicans can try to make among themselves. But ultimately, the question is still a political one, which is, what do you have the votes for? And we're, I think, a little bit seeing a sort of inversion of the dynamic that has characterized Republican unified control in previous in sort of other episodes during the past 15 years, which I think for a while we generally thought sort of what the Senate wanted was what was going to rule the day, because it was harder to get things through the Senate. But I think the House is like putting up a fight on this question. Both the nature, the size of the House majority, and also the kind of nature of the divisions within the House Republican Conference. And here again, I'm thinking particularly around things like the ferocity with which the folks who really care about the SALT deduction held out for as generous of a change there as they could. And so I do think the Senate isn't going to like being told that maybe they have to concede to what can get through the House, and perhaps they choose to sort of play a little bit of chicken with the House and just say, like, no, this is what can get through the Senate, because that's not a walk in the park either. And then we're left with this question of how do we resolve the differences between the two chambers.
We got a great question from the audience that I want to turn to, but you just made me think of a follow-up, and that is, are we fully committed to the single bill at this point? Has the ship sailed on, splitting things up in different proposals? I know that was the House generally liked the one bill strategy. The Senate was making noise about, no, let's do this in two parts. Is the ship sailed on that? Are we committed fully to the one bill now?
I think the ship is like almost entirely out of the harbor, but there's one set of circumstances that I could imagine it returning to shore, if you will, which is that one of the elements in the bill that we haven't talked about is the fact that Republicans intend to use this reconciliation bill to carry an increase to the debt limit. And that probably needs to pass sometime in the summer, sometime in July, probably before the August recess, before we hit what folks call the X date, which is the point at which even using the Treasury Department's extraordinary measures, the federal government can no longer pay all of its bills. If things really start to go off the rails, and it is clear that they're going to have a hard time landing the plane on the bill in time for the August recess, I could imagine a scenario where they try to cleave off the debt limit part and do that separately. I don't know what it would take to get us to that point, but I could still, if I squint, imagine that happening. But I don't really see a place, though Senator Ron Johnson continues to sort of advocate for this. I don't really see a path at this point where we would go back to kind of the Senate's original plan from late winter, early spring of doing one spending only bill and then doing a second bill that has the extension of the 2017 tax cuts and other tax changes, and then probably also some spending cuts on the social safety net side.
Great. Thank you for that. So we got a really interesting question. I think this is something that came up in Climate Camp. You've talked a little bit about it today as well. But right now, these provisions are being moved sort of through the force of will by the majority. There isn't really a lot of minority involvement. And there's activity for sure, but the math is such that the majority will win. And that's why they're doing this. The question is, at what point can points of order be raised in the Senate to challenge bill provisions as being in the violation of the Byrd Rule? And is that something that might come into play around maybe some of the, the provisions that don't have an absolute 51 votes for? When does that happen? And what could the minority potentially do to carve out kind of a middle ground around some of these tax incentives?
Yeah, so I'm going to take this as just sort of a little bit of a broader question and like what's the minority party's role here? And I'll say three things. So one, there is a role for the minority party in the form of the committee staffs on the minority side in the stage that we're in right now, where certain issues get raised with the parliamentarian. The parliamentarian hears from both sides. Usually she initially hears from them like individually. So she hears from the Republicans on a question and she hears from the Democrats on a question. And then there's a second round where they sort of all come in and argue in an adversarial way for and against why a particular provision is or is not a Byrd Rule violation. So there's certainly a place there for the staffs on the committees of jurisdiction and on the staff of the Budget Committee on the minority side in trying to sort of raise arguments to the parliamentarian. If when the bill comes to the floor, there are still provisions in it that are potentially Byrd Rule violations, that's when we would see someone raise a point of order on the floor, objecting to something as a violation of the Byrd Rule. The Byrd Rule, like all of the Senate's rules, is not self-enforcing. So if even if the Republicans are told by the parliamentarian that something is a Byrd Rule violation, and they bring it to the floor, and they bring the legislation with that provision in it to the floor anyway, there's not some sort of automatic check at that point. That's when we would see a point of order raised. And then the last thing I would say, which is sort of outside the this kind of formal process, is that one of the things, whether there are markups in committee in the Senate or not, that I expect we will see Democrats as the minority party doing is try to raise the political salience of different things in the bill and trying to sort of shape the politics of what's happening, even if they don't have the same kind of procedural powers, because this is moving without the threat of a filibuster. So up till now, we've seen a lot of this in the messaging around the number of individuals who are expected to lose health insurance coverage as a part of this bill. Again, That's a piece that we haven't talked about, but in terms of changes to Medicaid, changes to Medicare, uh, changes to the Affordable Care Act marketplaces, lots of discourse around that number and what that will look like.
Very interesting. We are at time, and our goal is to, if you give us 30 minutes, we give you what you need to know. But we just got another question, and it has to do with whether or not the parliamentarian will carry the day. There was just a debate about this, I think, with the California waiver, where there was a ruling and it ended up not prevailing at the end. What would have to happen for the parliamentarian to become formally overruled if there's a dispute that doesn't go the way the majority would like it to go?
Yeah, so I'll answer the procedural half of this without going into a lot of weeds because that might take me another 30 minutes. But to suffice it to say, if Republicans have 51 votes, either from their own conference or with the tie-breaking vote of the vice president, they can either disregard the advice of the parliamentarian or actively overrule something that she has advised them on the floor. So they can do that at a simple majority threshold if they are sufficiently determined to do so. What I will also say is that we did absolutely see the recent episode with the California emissions waiver. And we did see them sort of work around the parliamentarian, reach an outcome at odds with her advice in that case. And we should keep that as context. I also think it's helpful to remember that reconciliation, the role of the parliamentarian in reconciliation, is a little bit of a different kettle of fish in that we have reached a point, for better or worse, where so much of a majority party's legislative agenda ends up flowing through the reconciliation process. But having the parliamentarian as someone who everyone defers to for her advice on these questions actually often solves kind of political problems for the majority party as much as it does create headaches for them. So I think one of the reasons why it's persisted as an institution that people trust and people listen to is because sometimes what comes to the parliamentarian is something that the majority party doesn't actually want to do, doesn't actually have the votes for. And then they can, when she says no, when she advises no, they can say, oh, not our fault. That wasn't our, this is getting out of the bill and it wasn't us, it was her. And so having that sort of blame mechanism is actually really helpful to majorities when they're trying to navigate narrow margins and lots of competing policy priorities.
Anything that can help strip away those thorny issues, I'm sure, much appreciated. We are at time, and so we will, Molly, thank you so much for joining us today. I don't know, maybe we'll have to do more of this. We didn't get to so many issues. There's just so much happening. And of course, now there's all sorts of drama in the news that is, will affect some of these tax incentives, but won't affect other ones. But thank you so much, and good luck keeping up with all of the requests on your expertise over the next weeks and months. I know you can do it. This was great. It was so interesting, and thanks to everyone who offered questions and who participated in the Mentimeter. We will, what you see now is, our goal here is to make these rapid readouts as responsive to the needs of congressional staff. Congressional staff on both sides of the aisle right now are up to here with all of this, and we appreciate that, but there's other issues going on as well. So if you have a moment or an idea for a future topic for one of these rapid readouts, please let us know. We will absolutely take all of your suggestions and do our best to, whether it's this or a different type of resource. We realize just how much everyone is overloaded right now, and to the extent that our resources can help people understand and give their bosses good advice about what to do and to serve the needs of their constituents, that's the name of the game here. So I really appreciate everyone's feedback about that. We also have a survey, and that'll pop up on the screen. if you have 2 minutes to share the survey, if you have any questions, I know some of you are watching us on Instagram, some of us are watching us on the livecast page, some of you will come back and watch this a little bit later. If you have any feedback about the format or additional topics, please let us know. We read every response. It only takes a few minutes to complete the survey. We also have additional resources coming up. I mentioned these at the top of the briefing, but next Friday we will be looking at federal highway policy. And we also will be back the following week, I think it's June 17th, with our friends at the Federation of American Scientists to take a look at the 2025 Heat Action Plan, which is going to be a really, really great briefing. If that is not interesting enough to get you in the room, we're going to have ice cream sundaes, because that is one way to beat the heat, literally and figuratively. So join us for that. The best way to keep up with everything that we do at EESI is by subscribing to our biweekly newsletter, Climate Change Solutions. You can do that by visiting us at eesi.org. Thank you again to Molly, and thanks to everyone behind the scenes at EESI, Omri, Dan O, Allison, Hannah, Anna, Nicole, our fabulous interns. Thanks to everyone who pulls these briefings off for us. And until the next time, TGIF, and good luck keeping up with things. And we're always available for questions and ideas and things like that. So thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend, and we'll be back next Friday with a look at federal highway policy.